Welcome to the Noir Poise podcast, where wisdom is power is more than just a motto.
It's our way of life. While we don't claim to have all the answers, we're dedicated to delving deeper into different topics through meaningful conversations. As a duo, we bring different viewpoints to the table, enriching our joint journey towards growth and poise.
Join us as we explore and unlearn to relearn while striving to navigate life with poise. Do you think everyone has to heal from their childhood, no matter how good their childhood was?
To some extent, yes. And I say yes because, as the saying goes, sometimes too much of a good thing isn't a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are people who grew up with a healthy childhood, but still, because of life is life, there's still something that you could work on. There's some type of healing that you need. Because if I were to tell my life story, I grew up in a great loving home.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, no one is perfect, but compared to what I've heard out there, as far as parenting wise, my parents were phenomenal. But still, I had to revisit my childhood constantly to learn about the challenges I faced and how it impacted me as an adult now. So I think there's always the case where you should be learning about your inner child.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
I actually read this quote that says, your inner child still needs to be loved in order to heal the complete self.
I agree with that.
And I love that so much because I think as adults, we're always looking for purpose, always looking for joy, happiness, whatever that may look like. And we often go from job to job, friends to friends, traveling, whatever it may be, looking for that happiness. And sometimes we find it, but I've noticed that a lot of times that happiness doesn't last. And I think it's because there's something within you, your inner child, that also needs to be loved. And whatever we desired as a child, I noticed that we also crave as adults.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
This quote, it brings to the forefront how important it is to learn your inner child, and not just learn about your inner child, but do things to actively give your inner child that peace and happiness that he or she's desperately looking for.
I think that's why it's important to not only just figure out what your inner child desired, but like you said, find ways and do things to nurture that part of you and to kind of, in a sense, find closure with those parts of you.
Yeah. I'm sure you've noticed this in everyone who has ever had the opportunity to sit with friends or family members and reminisce about the old times. Like, it's a different type of joy. When you're talking about just your childhood and things that you experienced that you're recalling, looking at old photos, I think the reason why those moments are so joyful to us is because our inner child is looking for that connection with us. And I think whenever we call a memory from our childhood, a pleasant memory from our childhood, it's subconsciously our way of trying to say, learn from that moment and try to repeat it.
That's interesting. I can see that. But what would you say in regards to the negative things from childhood, though?
I would say the same thing flipped, where if you're recalling a negative experience from your childhood and it's still impacting you emotionally, I think that's you subconsciously telling yourself, find some way to correct that wrong. Like for me, growing up, I was taught and trained to always think of others. I have an older brother and a younger sister. And one of the lessons that my mom still to this day say she's proud of teaching us is whatever we have, we should share with one another. And she used to say all the time, even if we had a grain of rice to eat, divide that grain of rice by 3.
Yeah, as it should be. Yeah.
Ensure that everyone's getting their fair share. As positive as that is, I think it taught me to always not just consider others, but put other people before me.
That's interesting.
And it's not just that example with sharing, but
Yeah.
with everything. I was really taught to, put others before me, and given the label as a responsible kid, mature for my age. So naturally that made me always consider others before myself. And into adulthood, I noticed that it was very difficult for me to do things for myself now.
Mm.
Even earlier this week, actually, I had a pair of sneakers, sneaker shoes that I just put on to, for quick errands, nothing fancy or serious. And I noticed it started to wear off a bit. And I kept on telling myself, okay, I need to get new sneakers. I need to get new sneakers. It got to the point where it became obvious that these sneakers are done.
So funny.
But for one reason or another, I still couldn't bring myself to buying.
Right. Because that's something you do struggle with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
but if I said it, you would have gotten sneakers from me immediately.
That's exactly my point, where if I noticed that was happening to you, my mother, my father, my siblings, I'd be quick to make a purchase. But for some reason with me, I find it difficult to do that. And I think it stems from my inner child, where I always prioritize something else before myself. So growing up, if I could have spent money on, a clothing item for myself, I thought about some of the bills that my parents had to pay, and I would buy with that. Or if I was outside and I was hungry and I wanted to buy something to eat, and my mom so happened to ask me if I could stop by the market for her, I would set aside my hunger and, buy whatever I need to buy at the market. And that translates into adulthood as I'm still putting everyone else before me. And even when it makes sense to do something for myself, I have a hard time doing it. In a sense, I almost feel guilty doing it.
Right. I actually can relate to that heavy. But I'm glad you brought that up, because you mentioned you're one of three, right? And I think it's important to also consider what was taught to you versus what you've perceived of it. Because while that was taught to all three of you, I know all three of you, you and your siblings, none of you think the same. None of you act the same. You know what I mean? So while you're like that, I think it also depends on how you perceive the information that was being taught to you. And I think that's important to consider in the process of being able to nurture our inner child, because in your adulthood, you may still be perceiving certain information with that same kind of mindset, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm glad that you said that, because I'm the oldest, but I was raised in a home half of my life with cousins. So it was like 5 of us. And while it was 5 of us, there were times it was 7. There were times it was 8. It depends on who was sleeping over at the time. So while I am the oldest child of my mom's, I always had other kids around. So sometimes I was one of the oldest, sometimes I was one of the youngest. You know what I mean? And similarly to you, that same concept was placed on me too, but I don't think everyone perceived it the same way.
You'll actually be surprised at how much of an impact your inner child is having with the present you. Even something as little as what was entertaining to me as a child, I notice now as an adult, I still react the same way. So for example, I was a big fan of wrestling. I don't remember when I stopped watching it, but I do remember that when I was still into it, other people my age were being phased out of it. So it wasn't something that I discussed publicly, because I didn't want to be embarrassed. So now, even as adulthood, I noticed that the things that are entertaining to me, I only watch when I'm alone. And I don't even do it consciously. I think for the most part, it could be subconscious, where I don't want anyone to judge me. I don't want anyone to have anything, negative to say or look at me like I'm immature. So you think
that's what you subconsciously are feeling, and that's why you're doing it without recognizing that you're doing it. Okay.
That's just an example of how much your inner child comes out in your adulthood without even really recognizing it.
Yeah. So just so everyone understands what we mean by inner child, when we keep saying that, your inner child is part of your subconscious that has been picking up messages way before it was fully processed about what was going on mentally or emotionally. So the examples you gave about what was taught to you versus what you perceived of it now causes you to react and do certain things in your adulthood. That's what the inner child is. You've perceived certain things, you've received certain things emotionally and mentally before you could actually understand it fully or grasp it. And so you carried those messages with you into your adulthood. And now you're doing things in your adulthood that show signs that you haven't healed or nurtured the inner child that never really understood those things that happened back then.
It's funny that you said that because before I made the connection of why I think I hesitated to buy things for myself, I always assumed that I was just procrastinating. Where one day I will, and just never came. Because I do remember times when I would make a whole shopping list for myself. Clothes I wanted, shoes, sneakers, boots that I wanted, like everything from jackets down to socks and ties. And I never got the things on my list.
You're saying you did that as a child or now?
I did that as in like early adulthood.
Okay, that's very I'm going to mention something. I don't know if you want me to, but I remember specifically you telling me that when you were a kid, I don't know if it was like a magazine or a book or something, you would circle all the things you wanted.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
You would circle all the things you wanted, and then you would give it to your mom and hope that she would get you something off the list.
Yeah.
And you didn't get anything on your list.
Right.
That's an interesting connection. So that's a great example
Yeah.
of how, because as a child, I'm sure, yeah, it probably hurt you a little bit. You may or may not have held on to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that example literally illustrates what I just read about the inner child taking messages before you could even comprehend what's actually happening. And as an adult now, you do it to yourself.
Yeah.
Not realizing that this is something that you've been doing
all my life.
All along. All along, which is so sad. But that's a great sign to illustrate that there needs to be some nurturing done. There needs to be some healing after you become aware of something like that. That's when you need to start going on the journey to nurture that part of you. And that's what we mean when we say nurturing your inner child. So that, among many other examples, are some of the things that people may experience and not recognize that this is a sign that there's a part of you that needs to be nurtured or that needs to be paid a little bit closer attention to. Some of them are simple things that you hear people go through on a regular basis, you know, like low self-esteem and unexplained anger, chronic insecurity. Those are just examples of your inner child being neglected or have been neglected. And as the adult version of you, you now have to pay attention to it and begin to nurture it so that way you can become whole again, in a sense.
It's like what I said earlier about whatever we desired as a child, we crave as adults. What you'll notice when you really start thinking about it is your inner child is always crying out. Sometimes, and I'm sure everyone could relate, someone may say something very minor to you, but it stings you so much.
Yeah, when you're just like, why is this offending me so much?
Yeah, why is this offending me so much? Like little things like that, when you're unsure of why you feel the way you feel, it could be your subconscious, your inner child trying to, get your attention to say, hey, this is an area that you need to focus on.
Right. And there's also the factor that, like, when you're unaware of these emotions that you're experiencing, or you're unaware of the foundation of where they're stemming from, you'll start to repeat certain cycles without recognizing it. Like a simple example is, we hear people say this all the time, I want to be nothing like my parents, right? So many people want to be nothing like some of their parents for whatever reason that is. And it may not be that your parents are terrible or anything, but there's something about them that you're just like, nah, I'm not doing that. But when you don't stop to recognize why that is, or make yourself more aware of the foundation of it, you end up repeating the cycle. And you'll find that as you get older, you become your parents, right? And I think it's similar with ourselves. When we don't stop to recognize where some of these emotions are stemming from and then take initiative to nurture it, you'll start to realize that you may go on in like this constant cycle, you know?
I've shared this with you before, how oftentimes I feel that I've missed my chance with certain things. But I read this quote that really liberated me from that thought.
I'm interested to hear. Because I disagree with that thought that you had. So
the quote says, "It's never too late to have a happy childhood." The reason why I love that quote so much is because I've thought about nurturing my inner child. It's something I say all the time to you, actually.
Yeah.
Like, what does your inner child want?
Yeah.
But in the back of my mind, I always believe that it's too late.
Yeah. Because you don't view yourself as a child. It makes sense because you're like, my childhood's over, but not realizing like, we're still those individuals. We just grew in size and we may have grown mentally, emotionally, and, you know.
And we have more responsibilities.
Right. But those core things are still there.
Yeah.
So you can make that shift and create a more joyful experience, if that makes sense.
So I think the first step is to understand that it's not too late.
Yeah. I love that you said that. It's never too late. That's hard to actually accept. You've ever heard people say something to the extent of like, if you don't make plans for your life, life will make plans for you.
Oh, yeah,
like something to that. Yeah. So I look at it that way, where if we don't take initiative in healing those parts of us that are not benefiting us, or trying to understand foundational things and make the connection so you can then stop that cycle, you're going to keep going in that same cycle. And it may not even look the same way. So you may not recognize it until you do some really deep reflection. But we tend to go through things over and over in different scenarios, different aspects of our lives. It may be this time it's with your career. This time it's with a loved one. This time it's with goals. You know what I mean? Like it comes in different forms, but it's the same cycle that we keep doing to ourselves. And then again, self-reflection. That is like the word of the year, I feel like. Self-reflection and tips on self-reflecting and identifying what aspects of your inner child need attention. Like you said, first, embracing that it's never too late, and then embracing that part of you. A lot of times we fall into denial and we try to like negate or neglect certain things that we feel and tell ourselves to man up, or we're looking into it too much. We're overthinking. I personally believe sometimes you got to sit in that emotion and comprehend it. And in comprehending it, it allows you to give yourself self-compassion and a little bit of forgiveness in healing the inner child. Because like you said, some things lead to you feeling guilty. And I don't think that's uncommon. I think that's actually pretty common in people, where we hold ourselves accountable for certain things that occurred or certain feelings we may feel about stuff. For example, you stated that you feel like your parents were great parents, but still, of course, no one's perfect. There are many things that you feel like could have been a little bit different. And because of those challenges, you felt like it impacted you in a negative way. And that's understandable why that would make you feel guilty, because you're just like, my parents did the best they could. It's not their fault, or whatever the case is. So I think it's important to forgive yourself.
One thing that I believe helps is once you start identifying what your inner child is saying, then start to treat yourself as you would want to be treated from a parent's point of view.
That's good.
So if you were your own mother and you knew you felt this way, what would you do at the moment? If you were your own father and you knew you felt this way, what would you do as at the moment? I think that's a great way to start the healing process. Because a lot of times, whether it's for positive or negative reasons, we really don't know what to do with the memory. We understand what we felt, but we don't necessarily know what to do. So a little role play here is, I think, beneficial. If you were to be your own parent and you knew, using the example earlier, if me as a parent, I knew that my son created a list of things that he wanted to do, then I would definitely want to get him some things that's on the list, if not everything.
Mhm.
Start there.
Yeah.
Because naturally, when I think
Sometimes
of
it's that simple.
right, naturally, when I think of that list, I just think of all the toys that I wanted that are probably,
Yeah.
nowhere
And
to
now,
be
like in
found
your
now.
30s, you go buy all those toys. It's like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, but do you need them?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like what they say, where you become an adult and then you almost have to parent yourself all over again.
Yeah.
Because some of those things were just not dealt with the right way. And now that you know better, you do better.
Right.
At some point, when you become an adult, it's your obligation to then teach yourself and heal yourself.
And that healing won't occur overnight. And this is one of these things where it sounds like it's going to be easy, but it's actually going to be pretty difficult.
Yeah.
We often complain about people not listening to us when in reality, we're clearly not listening to ourselves. So that process may not be easy, but it's certainly worth it. And it's kind of like what they say, riding a bike. Once you learn how to ride a bike, no matter how long you stop riding a bike, once you get on it, it starts to become muscle memory. Once you start identifying what your inner child is saying to you, it's going to become a little bit easier. But initially, don't expect it to be easy.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be easy at all. I think even for us, like we've been trying to do this. We're still trying to do this actively in like different random ways. And it's hard to even identify what ways you can nurture your inner child, in my opinion. It took us a while, and I think it helped us understanding each other's childhood to then have the other person be like, I think maybe you should do this, or maybe you should get yourself that shirt. Maybe you should take yourself out on that specific, date or whatever the case is. It's important to have someone to kind of like hold you accountable and to understand your history too, because then they can kind of interject where needed.
And I'm sure you'll agree, but this is a lifelong journey.
Yep. It never ends.
So don't think, you know what, I'm going to focus on my inner child for a year or two and then bam, I'll be good. No, you could be 90 years old.
You would still be focusing on that
on your inner child.
Because it's such an important part of our lives. Like, while we're young, only a small portion of our lives, it literally sets the path for us, for our future. So there's things like we're dealing with now in our adulthood. It has nothing to do with any experiences we had in our adulthood and everything to do with one small experience we had as a child. That's the unfortunate truth. It took me a long time to accept that a lot of what I do now has nothing to do with the situations now most of the time. So that's why we'll probably spend our whole lives. You deal with one thing and you're just like, oh, snap, there's another. You handle that and you're just like, oh, gotta nurture this part of me. But another tip would be creating like a self-care routine that kind of honors your inner child. And do so while trying to find balance in your adult responsibilities. So it may sound silly, but like for your example, making that list and saying, you know what, as an adult, I can't get 20 things off this list. And realistically, I may not even need it. But I'm going to honor that inner child and tell myself that I'm going to get one or two items that may be useful for me now. It's simple things like that that I think can start us off in healing and nurturing our inner child.
If you find yourself still struggling, one suggestion I would have is think about the extremes.
What do you mean by that?
What was the happiest time that you ever had as a child? What was the angriest you've ever been as a child? What is the saddest you've ever been as a child? What is the most peaceful time you've ever been as a child? And compare that to what's currently going on in your adult life.
That's good.
And you'll be able to find a connection there.
I'm going to do that. Interesting. Okay. So it's all about not neglecting your emotions, sitting in them, analyzing them, and learning from them. And in doing so, this is something that I had to really take a lot of initiative in, disregarding the opinions of others as you do so. Because it may not make sense to those around you, but if you know this is something that you're trying to heal and move forward from, it only has to make sense to you. You know your story, you know your path, and you're the one that's going to be heavily benefited or affected negatively by it. It may be something as simple as, I always wanted to be a singer when I was a kid. And part of my childhood was just singing for hours and hours, so on and so forth. And you just take time out of the day to just reminisce and relive that moment of just singing into a mic. Get a karaoke mic, sis, and spend time karaokeing. It's sometimes those smallest little things that will bring like a form of joy for you. So it's all about finding those little tiny bits and pieces of joy and reliving them, finding those bits of pieces of unhappiness and shifting them. You're gonna encounter obstacles. That's just part of the process.
I actually wanted to add something to that. One of the obstacles you may encounter is you may have to relive those same emotions that you did as a child.
Yeah,
So,
that
like,
part.
using me as an example, let's say throughout the journey, I realize, okay, I need to start prioritizing myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I do that. But then I have, someone bring something up that makes me feel guilty for
Right.
spending money on myself when something else was in need. That's
Mm-hmm.
literally what happened to me as a child, and it's happening again.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think everyone should be prepared for, that you may have to literally
Yeah, I think that
relive
part's
that.
inevitable. You're gonna relive it. I personally think it's a good thing, as annoying as it is in the process. It's a good thing because, like we mentioned in a previous podcast, that shows that there's more to learn throughout those emotions. There's more to learn throughout that experience. So I personally think it's a great thing when you feel like you're reliving it, because now it's your time to then shift it, like we've discussed, right? It's time to now make decisions or move in a way that allows you to shift the past a little bit. And that will then create the trajectory for the future in a direction leading you forward. Yeah. Thank you for spending your time with us. We hope you gained some knowledge today that'll promote poise in your life. We have new episodes uploaded every Thursday right here, same place, same time. Until next time, you can follow us on Instagram at Noir Poise Podcast to stay connected. That's NOIRPOISED Podcast. We'd love to hear your feedback.
And remember, your wisdom is power.